selection of scripture is all one story from Esther that I found very interesting. I'm not sure I was ever that familiar with this story. So,
and let us open our hearts and minds to receive it. From Esther 4, 6-17. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther, explain it to her, and charge her to go to the king to make supplication to him and entreat him for her people. Hathach went and told Esther that what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a message for Mordecai, saying, "All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. All alike are to be put to death. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to somebody may that person live. I myself have not been called to come in to the king for 30 days. When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to the royal dignity for just such a time as this." Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him.
from Esther chapter 7, 1-6, and 9-10. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, as they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given to me. That is my petition. And the lives of my people, that is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace, but no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king." Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he who has presumed to do this?" Esther said, "A foe, an enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance to the king, said, "Look, the very gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, stands at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the anger of the king abated.
Continuing in Esther 9, 20-22. Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, adjoining them that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and also the 15th day of the same month, year by year, as the days on which the Jews gained relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and presents to the poor.
So I want to tell you a story. The story is set in ancient Persia when King Ahasuerus ruled the Persian Empire from India to Ethiopia, a massive amount of territory. King Ahasuerus sat on the throne in a city called Susa. Now, the story begins, actually, by telling us that King Ahasuerus had a queen named Vashti. Now, one day, the king threw a huge banquet, multi-day long kind of banquet, with all the royal attendants and food and clothing and all of the stuff that goes with it. And about the 6th or 7th day of partying with his friends, the king sent a message to Queen Vashti and told her to get all dressed up and make herself beautiful and to come before all of the people at the party and to stand there in order for people to look at her because she was beautiful. The king wanted to show how awesome he was and to show how many things he owned, including showing off his beautiful queen, Vashti, as an object of desire. And the queen said no. She refused to come and be this object in front of all of the guests. And this made the king mad. Now, interestingly, the scripture tells us that it not only made the king mad because it embarrassed him in front of the guests, it also says that it made him mad because he realized that by the queen challenging what he told her to do, that word would spread throughout the entire empire, and that all of the other women might get it in their heads to challenge the men in their lives who had control over them. By saying no to the queen, Vashti was actually a threat to the entire system of domination and control by men in the empire. And now you can't have that, can you? So the king went to his lawyers and found the official legal loophole that he needed, and he sent out word, an official kingly decree throughout the entire empire, saying that Vashti would never again come before the king, and that she was being stripped of her title as queen. And they were starting the process to find a new queen. The process begins of finding the new queen. The process, by the way, involved collecting all of the most beautiful young virgin girls that they could, collecting them in Susa in the center of the empire, and then spending almost a year training them in how to perfume themselves and to make themselves as beautiful as possible. And then after all of that training was complete, one by one, each of these young virgin girls went in to spend a night with the king. And then after all of that had happened, whoever pleased the king the most became the new queen. Now, in the city of Susa, there was a man named Mordecai. Mordecai was a Jewish man. The Jews were an ethnic minority at this point in the empire. And Mordecai found himself raising his cousin named Hadassah. Hadassah's parents were both killed, and she had found herself as an orphan. And so it says that Mordecai raised her as his own daughter. Hadassah, by the way, is the Hebrew name for Esther. In any case, Mordecai sends Hadassah, or Esther, into the selection process for becoming the new queen, and sure enough, one thing leads to another, and she winds up finding the favor of the king and was selected to replace Queen Vashti. It's also worth noting here that Mordecai gave her fairly strict instructions to not reveal her Jewish ethnicity to the king, or even her relationship with Mordecai. Now, after Esther becomes queen, there's a whole series of events that take the story to the next level. Most importantly, there's a man named Haman who is a guy who is incredibly power hungry and winds up getting appointed to one of the highest positions in the entire empire. And at one point, Haman is in a group of other people where he wants to show off his power a little bit, and so he tries to force everybody there to bow down to him. Now, this group includes Mordecai, and Mordecai is not about to bow down to anybody because he's Jewish and he only bows down to God. This, as you might guess, makes Haman incredibly mad. So mad that he hatches this elaborate plan to be able to not only kill Mordecai himself, but also to have the entire Jewish people exterminated throughout the entire empire. He gets the king to send out a decree that on a particular day, everybody throughout the empire is supposed to find the Jewish people living next to them and kill them. Mordecai is disturbed by this when he finds out about it. And he sends word to Esther and tells her that she needs to go to the king and try and get this stopped. As we heard in our scripture today, however, Esther does not want to go. And I think that's primarily because she knows that coming in unannounced to the king is incredibly dangerous. It might even mean the end of her life. And this is not an unreasonable thing to be afraid of either. After all, she knows that she is sitting there as queen because another woman in her position dared to challenge the king and suffered the repercussions because of it. Nevertheless, Mordecai presses her in saying, look, if you don't step up now, salvation is going to come to the Jews in another way, but you're here for a reason. This is your time to say something. And so, Esther makes the bold decision to speak up, knowing that it may even mean the end of her life. After 3 days of fasting and prayer, she goes into the king's courts. And she tells the king that she has a request, but that she wants to bring that request at a banquet that she would throw for the king and for Haman. Now, meanwhile, while all of this is happening, Haman is still plotting to kill Mordecai. He even winds up building a gallows at his own house in order to hang Mordecai at his own place. However, when Haman and the king finally come to the banquet, things begin to flip pretty quickly. Through a series of events and through Esther's coming out to the king as Jewish and begging for her life and for the lives of her people, it eventually comes to light that Haman has actually tricked the king, and that the king winds up getting pretty mad about that and eventually having Haman hung on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai at his own house. What's more, Mordecai winds up getting an official position within a position of status within the kingdom and all of the riches that go with it. And, oh, by the way, Mordecai and his family actually take over Haman's house and his mansion. It's a reversal of fortunes. Most importantly, however, the king sends out a new decree to the entire empire that instead of everybody getting to kill the Jews on this particular date, well, actually, he completely reverses it and says now the Jews can kill anybody who they would like to on that particular day. And, well, things get bloody. It's kind of another story. Then, after all of this, in the book of Esther, we get to the last chapter. And the last chapter is what tells us, interestingly, that this story is the basis for the holiday of Purim. Purim, if you don't know, is a modern Jewish holiday. Well, it's an ancient and modern Jewish holiday. But in the modern world, it's a little bit like Jewish Mardi Gras. There's a lot of festivities and people dressing up in costumes and kind of a couple of day party, that kind of thing. There's even a reading of Esther during the festival of Purim where there's audience participation. Basically, every time that Haman's name is read, the audience is supposed to boo and hiss loudly so nobody ever actually hears Haman's name. I still find it interesting that this story leads to this particular holiday. Now, there's a lot of interesting things about the story of Esther and the history of Esther that I find really fascinating that we could dive into. One of which is that in the story of Esther, in the Hebrew version of it, God is never mentioned. There are a couple of places where God is implied to be working, but God is never really a part of the storytelling in the Hebrew version, which is something that probably deserves its own sermon on another day. There's a whole bunch of these kinds of things that we could dive into, but that we're not going to today. And the reason is because as I sat with Esther this week, there were two main things that jumped off of the page at me that I think we need to pay attention to. There were two important messages that kept coming up. And I think they're messages that are actually very closely related to each other. The first of which is a message that I think we all need to hear, which is that that sometimes we find ourselves in opportunities in life to speak up, to make a real difference for others. And sometimes when doing so, well, we might find ourselves being placed at personal risk in order to do the right thing. See, it's interesting to me that Esther found herself in a particular position in life through a series of events that, quite frankly, I have a hard time calling divinely inspired. There's a whole lot of messed up stuff that got Esther to where she wound up. And I have a hard time saying that God did all of that to put her in that position. But nevertheless, Esther is in this position. And in this position, a situation arises where she has the opportunity to speak out on behalf of other people and to influence the world around her in a larger kind of way. And the thing is that it's amazing that she did that knowing that she was putting herself at personal risk in order to do the right thing. The larger message here for all of us is that we may find ourselves in an Esther position, an Esther situation. A situation that may not seem particularly divinely inspired, but yet where the opportunity to do something important shows itself. Maybe it's a position at our jobs, or maybe it's just simply finding ourselves out at lunch with someone, or maybe it's in the airport waiting for a flight. It could be something incredibly mundane, but yet all of a sudden we find ourselves with a chance to do something important. Maybe it's stepping into a situation where we see somebody being hurt or abused. Maybe it's in a business meeting where a decision is being made between taking care of the workers of a company or enriching shareholders, and we might have a voice in that decision. Maybe it's simply talking with someone over coffee about a significant event in their lives. Maybe it's following that feeling to pick up the phone and call someone that comes to our mind to find out what's going on. I mean, there's all sorts of different places and times or that would be otherwise ordinary or mundane times where moments of significant opportunity present themselves. They are moments where we have the choice to act, where we need to be ready to act. We need to be looking for those moments. And yes, sometimes those moments put us at significant personal risk. Well, I think this message is true for all of us. There is also a specific version of this message that has been on my mind a lot this week and the week before. We're living in a time where men are starting to wake up to just how widespread sexual violence really is in this culture and how deeply ingrained it is in our culture. And I say that men are waking up to this because what the Me Too movement has shown us is that women have pretty well known this forever. It's men who are realizing this. In the past couple of weeks, the most recent round of this national conversation and awareness has come because of the accusations by Christine Blasey Ford against Brett Kavanaugh, the nominee for the Supreme Court. Now, I think the conversation about that particular testimony could be had at some point, but there's actually something in the run-up to that has struck me in a particularly important way. After the accusation from Dr. Ford came out, the President of the United States had a tweet that said, well, if this was really as bad as she said it was, why didn't she report it 30 years ago? And in response to that tweet, there was a hashtag that got started. Now, for those of you who don't know what a hashtag is basically a way on social media to be able to take a whole bunch of different individual posts and tie them together with a theme. And you can then go back and search for what people have posted on that particular theme. In the last several weeks, the hashtag #WhyIDidn'tReport has been trending quite a bit on social media. And I've spent a little time reading through these stories. And these stories are basically filled with women sharing stories and reasons why they did not come forward and report the abuse that happened to them years ago, right away when it happened. In fact, in some cases, there are people who first publicly admitted that something had happened in this particular thread. And if you've ever wondered why sexual abuse goes underreported, I would encourage you to just go online and search for this hashtag and read some of the stories. You will instantly understand the tremendous risk that survivors place themselves in reporting what has happened to them. It's everything from embarrassment to the threat of continued violence from their abuser, to the threat of retribution at their job, to simply the fear of not being believed, to all kinds of other stuff. There are a lot of harrowing stories out there, but the main underlying theme that I picked up in the last couple of weeks is that basically survivors tend not to report what happened to them because they've been watching. They've watched what happened to other survivors who did report before them. They watched as other survivors were dragged through the mud and had their lives further destroyed when they came forward, and so they don't want the same to happen to them. Which is something that I see almost word for word in the story of Esther. Esther is hesitant to go to the king and speak out, in large part because she knows exactly what happened to the last woman who dared to challenge the king. In every story from every woman who has chosen not to report, I see Esther's initial response. And it's a response that's understandable and justifiable. And there's no shame in it. And all I'm saying is that in that story of Esther, those who haven't reported are in good company. The interesting thing about the story of Esther is that also in Esther's story, I also see every woman who has chosen to report the abuse that's happened to them. I see that in Esther's courage to eventually speak up, even if it puts her life at risk. While it's true that Esther and so many others have seen how survivors were treated badly before them, and so fear for themselves, it's also true that when survivors do speak out, their courage also gives courage to others. I think there's something true in the idea that when Vashti spoke out, that other women in the empire would find their own courage as well. In our own world in the last week, all we have to do is simply note that during Dr. Ford's testimony on Thursday, the National Sexual Assault hotline saw a 147% increase in their call volume. People watching her courage found their own courage. Now here's the thing. I do see the Esther story as a call for everyone to speak out in whatever situation we might have. I also see the tremendous strength of survivors mirrored in the strength of Esther. But actually, in the message of Esther, I think there's really a more critical message from this story that we need to hear for our time and our place. And interestingly, I don't think that message is for women. I think that message is for men. And it has to do with the culture of masculinity in which we live. In the story of Esther, what has been brought into clear focus for me in the last week is that the culture of the Persian Empire that they were living in was a whole culture that reinforced the belief that men had an absolute right to women's bodies and to control over their lives. And we might read this story and say, we might be tempted to say, well, yeah, but that was just the king. That wasn't necessarily everybody. But that's not true. Remember that the reason that the king punishes Vashti is to prevent women from throughout the entire empire for standing up for themselves. It was a whole culture thing going on, not just the actions of one person. And the truth is, as much as we would like to say that things are different now, I think the truth is that it's not. The flood of stories of famous men in the last several years who have only now come to account for their own abuses show us that, first off, powerful men still believe that they are entitled to women and their bodies in whatever way they like. But we should also note that just like the culture of ancient Persia, it's also true that we live in a culture that reinforces these attitudes and these beliefs for all men, not just powerful men. People far smarter than me have even described this culture that we live in as being one where a toxic form of masculinity creates what they call a rape culture that has become the norm. And the truth of the matter is that while it is important for survivors to report what has happened to them, in order for us to change this culture in the long run, it's actually men that need to take the responsibility to dismantle this sick and evil culture piece by piece. It is actually men who need to call out other men when we perpetuate this evil culture. It's not just locker room talk. Boys will be boys, must become boys will be decent human beings. Our task is not simply to believe and support survivors, although it is that. Our task is also to train up boys and men who don't sexually assault people. The message of Esther is that for such a time as this, God has placed us in a position to speak out. And yes, I hope that message from Esther inspires every survivor to say or do what they need to. But quite frankly, in this time and in this moment, the message of Esther is that men, particularly Christian men, need to begin to speak out. For such a time as this, that we have been given a voice and an opportunity to change the world for the better. To say that we in this church, in our families, in our jobs, in our communities, in our schools, and everywhere else that we have influence, that we are going to create a different kind of culture. That we are going to raise our boys, and yes, also our girls, in ways that dismantle the systems of domination and oppression and violence. For such a time as this, that we have been given a chance to make this world a better place. And it starts with us. With God's help, may we do the right thing, come what may. Amen.
Thanks for watching this video from the First Church of the Brethren in Wichita, Kansas. If you'd like to watch another video, click the link on the right. Thanks for liking, commenting, and subscribing on this video. And we'd love to have you join us on Sundays at 9:30 for Sunday school and 10:45 for worship. Everyone is welcome and you're invited.